Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
So let's get started. It is a pleasure to introduce Paul Van Oorschot, a repeat visitor who's going to talk to us about password aging policies and quantifying security advantages. Paul is well known to many of us. He used to work on crypto for a long, long time, but then saw the error of his ways and decided to start working on passwords. All right.
Thank you, Cormac.
Sure.
So very apropos intro, because what I'm going to do in this talk is actually go back to crypto and use crypto to set. So we're all familiar with password aging policies, and I don't need to ask people how excited they are about changing their passwords every 30 or 70 or 90 days. Generally, it's not very. It's not the thing people get up in the morning and say, today is the day I get to change my password. I'm very excited. But the problem here that I'm looking at is the expectation is that somehow this helps and this improves security. And we get this fuzzy feeling, or we're somehow convinced that this is going to help security a lot. But the question to ask is, how much does it help and in which ways? And so that's the question I want to explore. This work, actually, if you're interested in looking at the details, it's in a paper that'll appear shortly in a special issue of Designs, Codes, and Cryptography. Scott Vanstone actually was my PhD advisor. So the thing about password aging policies is we have this general notion, or we come to believe that it helps security in some vague ways, and I'll talk about a couple of them later. But quantitatively, what is the benefit? What gain? What benefit do we get? And in order to answer that question, the easiest thing to do is to try and formalize things. Now, if you formalize things, you end up making assumptions and models that don't actually map onto the real world. And so then, what's the value of your model? Well, I do start here by formalizing and going to a crypto security model where rather than passwords, which are chosen in a very skewed distribution by users, we're going to start out looking at cryptographic keys, which are randomly chosen and equally probable, in order to figure out what the bounds are. And then I want to take that, because we can get precise answers, and try and get some insight into mapping that on to real user passwords. And it'll turn out that'll give us some lower bounds, and with skewed distributions, we can then see what those bounds can tell us. And it turns out that it gives us some insights as to how bad things are, and that even in the idealized setting, things aren't great in terms of the advantages that we get. Okay, I'm happy to take questions throughout. I don't think I don't have an awful lot of slides here, so it's probably best to keep the context of a particular slide. So jump out if you have some questions. Okay, so here's the background thing to think about during the talk. Suppose you change your password continuously, basically as often as an interface allows. Does that prevent successful guessing attacks? So just try and think about that in the background, and then we'll try and put some precise numbers to that question. So here's the model we're going to start out with. I'm not claiming that this maps well onto user passwords, but this is where we start out by formalizing. So we have a crypto key search problem. You got a randomly chosen key. We're assuming we're going to do an exhaustive search. So there's a fixed key space. We assume there's capital R keys. And we assume that an attacker actually is going to be able to guess through all keys, all R keys. And we're going to have two different periods we're going to talk about. One is the exhaustive guessing time, the exhaustive period time, that's capital T. And the second time period we're going to talk about is the password expiration policy period, which is capital P. And we're going to go through a set of different sequences here where we're going to look at what the relationship between the exhaustive guessing period and the expiration period is, and then consider the different cases as well. So we're going to assume for simplicity an online guessing attack. I'll have some comments about offline later on. It's a deterministic finite search. So the attacker will be successful if you do not change your key. By the time he's guessed every single key through the key space, somewhere in there will be your key, and he'll have guessed it. Okay. The policy period is known. So, for example, you have to change your key every 30 days or 90 days or whatever. So that period is known, but the attacker does not know at which precise moment within that period an attacker changes his key. A user changes his key. And if the attacker gets to the end of his key space, we assume that he will just start guessing again. Now, when he guesses through the key space a second time, he might guess through it in a different deterministic order, but it is a deterministic order again that he's going to go through it. And so he'll guess through the key sequence once, every single one once, and then in a possibly different order next time. And we'll assume these are random orderings, and that allows us to get the probabilities and to analyze precisely.
This model suggests that you're positing that this policy is primarily to defend against online guessing?
Okay, so it turns out that's a good question. So the analysis is simplest if we if we assume it's an online guessing attack. It turns out there's a little hitch in this particular model that if it's an offline guessing attack, how does that map onto the real world? Well, it turns out if it's offline, if you actually change your key, then the attacker actually can't be verifying offline unless he grabs another copy of the key file. And so then you have to make, so just to avoid that issue right now, let's assume it's online guessing. We don't have to worry about that little glitch.
There's another time period to consider, which is how long between the attacker breaking your key and him selling to the black market to the bad guy in Ukraine who's stealing your money.
That's another question too, exactly.
Is there any sense of a lockout sort of thing, a time period of defense from the online aspect, maybe
No.
exponential lockout?
In this case, we're just going to assume, now these are defensive measures which can help you stop attacks, but let's just say that they don't do that. And it turns out, surprisingly, there's a lot of online properties that don't do that. And actually, they don't even do throttling. But anyway, so I'm just trying to, so I want to get through the simple model first, get some precise answers and equations, and then map to how that maps onto passwords. Okay, so here's.
So the attacker is only focused on one account at a time. Is that?
Again, for this analysis, let's assume that these are guesses on one account, and then we can go through and see if he's going to, in the real world, the attacker is going to probably guess the most probable password against all accounts, and then the second most probable against all accounts. But some attackers are looking to attack your account, but if it's a generic attack, they would probably do probable guesses, most probable guesses against all the accounts for which they have access. Okay, so here's the keys, K sub 1, K sub 2, up to K sub capital R. Let's assume that's a visual representation of the key space. And the user's key is going to be just lowercase k without a subscript. And he's going to guess, the attacker is going to guess key K sub I, at time T sub I, and right, bingo, that value there would be where he guesses the correct key. Okay, so the question then is, if you change your user key K to K star, so after U, lowercase u, units of time, if you change your key, what security advantage results? So what is the change in the probability of successful guess over all R guesses? Key point, we're assuming it's over all R guesses, okay? So that's the model we're going to set up. We're going to answer this question precisely, and then we want to map it to our real problem of interest. Okay, so for the first analysis, let's assume that the exhaustive guessing period, the time it takes for the attacker to guess all R keys, is capital T, and that's going to be less than or equal to the policy change period, which is capital P, which is your 90 days or whatever. Okay. Now, for the attacker to be successful, if we assume that there's two periods, call it W1 and W2, think about the user's key being K and then K star, and the attacker is successful if he guesses K while it's active in period W1, or K star in W2, and the only time that he's unsuccessful is if it's not K if it's neither K within W1 nor K star in W2. We can go through and figure out the exact probabilities here, because if the proportion of keys in W1, if it's changed after U units of time, the proportion of keys is U divided by capital R, and let's call that Q, and that leaves the proportion 1 minus Q in W2, and simply from the sizes of those partitions, you get the probabilities, because we're assuming it's a randomly chosen key and they're all equally probable. Okay. So just from that analysis and what's on that slide, the only case of success of attacker failure is if K is not in W1, K star is not in W2 down at the bottom here, and the probability is simply going to be 1 minus Q times Q. So the probability of success is going to be adding up Q1 and Q2 and Q3. Probability of attacker failure is Q4. Okay. So it turns out that our probability of success is 1 minus Q plus Q squared. Probability of failure is 1 minus that, Q minus Q squared. Does anyone know how to figure out a min-max here? Q minus Q squared, does that equal 0? Min-max occurs Q equals 1/2. Probability of failure, 1/4. Probability of success is 3/4. Okay, so this is what it looks like. You're going to get the minimum here. Probability of success gets minimized if the user changes exactly halfway through the period. It's still, probability of success is still greater than or equal to 75%. If you didn't change it at all, it was 100% probability of success for the attacker. If you do change it, at the optimal time, it drops to 75%. Okay? So this is, the x-axis is the proportion of the key space searched before the user changes the key. Y is probability of attacker success. Okay. Okay, so that's the simple base case, and then we're going to go through some more realistic cases. All right. Okay. So if the search fails again, what's the attacker going to do? They're going to repeat the search, starting through the key space in a possibly different deterministic order. If you then go through I different searches, lowercase I, then the probability of success is going to be 1 minus the probability that he fails on all the searches. So it's going to be 1 minus 1/4 of the I. Okay, so this is what happens. Across the bottom now we have the number of searches that the attacker gets, and already by the it's 0.75 probability of success here, goes up to 0.9375, then it's 98%, 99.6%. So even with a small number of total periods t, the attacker is going to have near guaranteed success. Okay, so that's not surprising, because what you're doing here is you're giving the attacker many more guesses. What turns out to be important is how many guesses does the attacker get? And changing the key ends up not changing the overall probability of success up here. So our summary from this is that when the exhaustive period t is less than or equal to policy expiration period capital P, the policy doesn't really help us. It doesn't give us a lot of hope. I mean, certainly in any sort of environment, you would hope that the attacker is going to have less than a 98% or 99% chance of success, right? Okay. All right. So that was our base analysis where t was less than or equal to p. It gives us, exactly the intuition for if t was equal to twice the policy period p. Well, the optimal thing here for the defender to do is to change their key halfway through the period. In fact, that was kind of what we modeled. When we modeled, if you don't have to change your key until 90 days, most users will not change it until 90 days. And so you'll almost always have it pushed out to the end. But the optimal thing to do here, if t was equal to 2b, the optimal thing would still be to change it after 45 days. We can't expect the users to do that, but that's what they would be best off doing if we knew exactly what the attacker's search time was. We don't know that. So it's very hard. So all the analysis we do here is actually assuming that the defender changes the key at the optimal time. We couldn't even achieve that with real users because we don't know what the real attackers have. Okay. Okay, so let's go forward a little bit more. Now, suppose we generalize. Suppose rather than t equal to p or t equal to 2p, we say t equals lowercase t times p. So for example now, the policy change period, the policy expiration period, capital P maybe is 30 days, 1 month, and the search time might be 24 months. So little lowercase t would be 24 here. So this may be, this models more of the space, right? So what happens here? Well, the analysis is almost exactly the same. The easiest way to go through the analysis is to assume the case lowercase t equals 3. So now we've got 3 periods here, W1, 2, and 3, rather than just W1 and 2. Go through it in your head for 3, but every time you want to use 3, stick in a t instead. You get exactly the same analysis. The only time the attack will fail is if the key for each period fails to be in all 3 of those. So it's going to be, the probability of failure is going to be 1 minus 1 over t to the t, probability of success 1 minus 1 over t to the t, and magically this little e comes out here. I don't know how that happens in mathematics. Somebody jigged the system many, many years ago, and this number comes up. So it turns out that if t gets very, very large, in this case, so the exhaustive search period for the attacker is very, very large, the probability of success is still going to be 63% or so. Okay, so this is what graphically we have. We start out here. This along the x-axis is t, and t is basically tells us the relationship between capital T and capital P here. So that's how many full exhaustive searches the attacker gets within one policy. That's how many policy periods there are in an exhaustive search period. And we come down here and very rapidly we hit a lower limit. So that the attacker search, as you can think of this as the attacker search power getting weaker, the expectation of success of attack success falls, but it doesn't get any lower than 0.632. Okay, so there's I don't know, intuitively you might have thought it would fall further than that. The numbers just tell us it doesn't fall any further than that. Okay, so that was for the case capital T is equal to lowercase t times p. Now, next thing we want to consider is, again, suppose we have multiple full exhaustive searches, I periods of full exhaustive search. Then the probability of success is going to be, well, 1 minus the probability of failure in each of those. We just get the exponent I on the right-hand side here again. Now, if we graph this one, I think this tells really the full story we want to get. So the difference here, on the x-axis, I've got how many full exhaustive search periods we have. And now the y-axis here is still the probability of attacker success, although this axis is kind of what you saw before in the other graphs. Here's our probability of success is 1.0. If you don't, with just one search period, it's 1.0 if you don't change your key at all. It's 0.75 if you change it once, so that's t equals 2. It's going to drop down or lower. It hits the limit here of 0.632. So this is all for one search period. But then you go across here, and in this graph, we're showing t is increasing with these different curves. So t equals 1 is this curve. T equals 2 is this curve. And it comes down. T equals 128 is this curve. It's not much different than t equals 32. And if you go to 256 and 512, you get essentially the same curve. So the curve doesn't change much over that. So with t increasing, meaning weaker attack, the attacker's search power is weaker, that helps the defender, but it gets bounded again essentially by this curve. And even when the attacker is in his worst case, he does not too poorly. And the sad news is that the probability of success is at least 95% if you get 3 or more search periods independent of lowercase t. and the probability of success is approaching 1.0, even for small I, independent of t. Okay, so again, boils down to the important point is how many guesses does the attacker get, not how often you're changing your key. All right. Changing the key helps a little bit. So
This seems to get very close to the limiting case, which is a game where I pick a random
Right.
password in the
Right.
space, and you try to guess
Right.
it, and then I
Right.
change, and you repeat.
right, exactly. And so I mean, this same analysis goes back to Des key search machines and the people that did the work, the crypto work on this, 20, 30 years ago. They'd say, yeah, that all makes sense. So now we're mapping that just to the password guessing problem.
You have an interesting definition of success. If the attacker finds today the key I used yesterday, you call it a success, and it doesn't seem to do them any good.
Well, this is the online attack. So he's got to use the key. He's got to find the key, and then he's got to use it and go online right away. So if for example you're targeting one individual, this is probably what they would do. If you're trying to harvest a bunch of keys and then sell them online in some underground system to someone else, then it's a different issue. Yeah. Okay. All right. So now let me make a comment on the exhaustive search time T being much, much longer than the policy period P, policy change period. So here you would actually have the key changing very, very often before the full exhaustive search. And again, the important point is not the number of changes, it's how many guesses the attacker gets. Okay. So limiting case we saw in that slide. So now a comment again about offline attacks here. So if you go back into some of the original documents, I guess, and these would be US government documents, probably the ones which most people would find before others. The original goal of password expiration policies was stated as being to limit the risk of password compromise in 1 year to 1 in a million. Okay, so that was what they stated their original goal was. Now this is entirely unattainable today if we think about offline attacks, and for a minute we assume there's no iterated hashing. Lots of people still don't do iterated hashing as a defense. Because modern processing resources easily allow 7 to 10 billion guesses per second. And if you take, for example, an 8-character totally random password, passwords aren't really totally random, but let's just say they were, and you had a 93-symbol alphabet, then you would be able to search through that full space of 52-bit space in 9 days, which would mean to reduce the probability of success to 1 in a million, you'd be changing your password every 800 milliseconds.
One processor doing the guessing?
Well, actually, yeah. And so attackers would typically have not just like quad-core processors, these are GPUs. You'd have 1,000 of these or you'd rent them, in the cloud. So, this is one processor, which is very, very cheap today.
I think you once convinced me the right
Yeah.
measure is not per processor, it's per
Cost.
dollar.
Per dollar, right? Yeah. Okay. So what this tells us is that the password expiration period, the aging policies, give absolutely no protection against offline attacks. Yeah.
No, well, I generally agree that these policies are useless. You're putting the context in, assuming the dumbest defender possible who's not iterating at all, not doing anything, and and in that case, right, if you've got someone with, if you actually had 52, something that's a space of 52 elements, and you're doing things sensibly, you're in pretty good shape. To say this is never good, and we're going to start by assuming that you hash in the dumbest way possible, and then assume that this argument carries over for all other reasonable ways of hashing, that logically doesn't follow.
Well, the argument I'm trying to make here is, what does the password expiration policy grant you? If you put in place a lot of these other things which you're mentioning, which are very useful, throttling and you're going to put in hashing, and of course you're going to do salting and other stuff. Well, if you do those things, you probably don't need to do password expiration at all. So that's the question. Yeah, yeah. Well, so if we can look and first decide what does the expiration, what does the changing itself give you, then we can try and weave together what the best defense is.
But your argument is like saying, well, if everyone has to set their password to dog, either dog or cat, then and they have to go back and forth between either dog or cat. Well, clearly password reset doesn't help you in this context. Therefore, it helps you in no contexts. I don't buy that argument.
Well, I mean, I'd love to chat with you for the next couple of days while I'm here about this. But what I want to do is I first want to see, I say right here, if we're looking offline, we're not iterating, what does it buy you? Okay. So that's what I want to establish. All right?
Okay.
Okay. So here's a partial summary of what we got. We can look at first saying that the exhaustive search period is about the same as the password expiration period or a little bit less. Then we can have a multiple. The password exhaustive search period is a multiple of the expiration period. And then we can talk about going through multiple searches over this space t, I times t. And in all cases, that alone, without these other defenses, is not going to help you an awful lot. Okay. So, but this is just for equiprobable random keys. This is not for user passwords. So can we use these bounds, these equations that we have, and say, okay, well, what happens when we actually have user-chosen passwords? Do things get better or worse? So the answer is they don't get better. And we shouldn't be surprised by that. So this is the background, 2 empirical studies here that help us understand where we go in practice with user-chosen passwords. So the first one is Joe Bonneau's study. He had access to 70 million Yahoo passwords here. And a couple of the things, data points from his study, for online guessing, if you were to try the most popular passwords on each of a large number of accounts, so say you got 10 guesses per account, you could get about 1% of the full space of passwords with simply 10 guesses per account, okay? So that shows you there's a lot of skew in real user-chosen passwords. And if you had the optimal attacker and they were able to carry out a massive search, so there was no throttling and a lot of other things weren't done, which you should do. If you got 1 million guesses per account, 10 to the 6 guesses per account, you'd get about 50% of user passwords. This is surprising. This shows really big skew on the front end of these distributions, right? There's also a study at CCS, published at CCS by Weir and colleagues. They looked at 32 million passwords, including most of that is the RockU data set. And of the 32 million passwords, they took a sublist of 5 million, and then they took the 50,000 most popular passwords from that sublist of 5 million, and then they took that 50,000 and guessed it on the remaining, I guess it would be the remaining, I think there were, well, but of the 32 million, I think there was only 13 or 15 million that were unique. So I think there was maybe 12 million or 50 million left. Take out 5 million, and of the remaining sublists of 1 million, they were able to get about 25%, over 25% on those other sublists. So big skew again there. So what this means is that the results are going to be worse for the defender when you're guessing against user-chosen passwords rather than crypto keys, because what's the attacker going to do? He's not going to guess randomly. He's going to try and use some empirical data and guess what are approximated to be the more popular passwords. Question?
So the point was brought up that users choose passwords differently. Some are really smart and really careful. And then there's my grandmother who really doesn't choose very good passwords.
The majority of the people are the grandmothers, because the rest of us who are smart, we're all in the room here because we're working at Microsoft and we're computer security experts, right?
Right. I don't want to tell you what my password was before I got into computer science. So you're suggesting that password expiration policy gives more benefits to the smart password choosers than to the dumb password choosers?
I don't remember saying that, but let me think. The expiration policies If we go through the crypto model, if the attacker gets to guess a sufficient number of guesses, he's going to guess through all the keys. But in practice, he's not going to guess the totally random ones because he won't get to those ones. Mainly because most attackers, they'd rather guess through more accounts of weaker users than they would be to try and get the tougher passwords. So I guess that's what I'm talking here on the next slide. The two main differences when you're trying to analyze for user-chosen passwords rather than crypto keys is one, there's a lengthened password variation. So we don't even know what the full set of passwords is because most systems don't truncate at 8. You can have 16 or 32 or maybe 64 character passwords or longer. But we can model that by saying the vast majority of users don't choose passwords longer than 16 characters or 12 characters or whatever. And that's not a bad approximation. But the skew in these distributions is the hardest thing to model. So what real attackers do, and this is what's important, is that they're what we call early quitters. They're going to not guess through full exhaustive spaces. They're going to guess the most probable keys against a larger number of accounts and never guess the very infrequent keys because that's not, unless they're doing a targeted attack just on a particular user, that's not the way they're going to get access to the greatest number of accounts.
More on numbers of smart users. The usual way Expiration works is I want to get into a site after a month. Bang, I have to change the password. Bang, I have to hunt down a piece of paper and, of course, invent a password on very, very short notice. It certainly makes me dumber than it would be if they gave me a week to think up a password and another week to train on it.
Well, so more about that in the last slide, but there is a side effect of the policies to keep into account as well. So what happens as a result of the skew is that if we looked at what the attacker's success would be over guessing full spaces, the results from the idealized model will be the same. But in fact, rather than over the full exhaustive period, if you look at how early in the period the attacker gets success, the more skewed the distribution is, the earlier we expect within the period that the attacker is successful. And so this makes online attackers very happy because the online attacker gets immediate feedback when they've guessed the right password. Okay, so the attack success rates from the idealized crypto model will be just as we said over the full period T, but it will be earlier within the periods. The offline attack, the full searches are basically going to happen pretty quickly with today's hardware. For the online attack, the skew is going to be very helpful. Okay, so let's come back then to say what does password expiration do? Does it actually stop guessing attacks? And I think the answer is no. If a password is guessable, meaning if it's within reach, then the password is guessable. If it's guessable, it's guessable, and the attacker's going to guess it. And if he doesn't guess it this period, he's going to guess it next period. Eventually, it's not a good defensive mechanism if you're really trying to rely on it. It's like playing hide and seek. It's the peas and the shells, and I'm going to move the shells around a couple of times. And if you guess it wrong the first time, you're going to guess it right the second time. There's only so many places I can move the shell, right? If the attack vector is not a guessing attack, then expiration periods can temporarily stop an ongoing access. If I have a password and I'm using that password continually to access your account and you change your password, changing the password is going to help. But the expiration period won't stop continued access if there's a backdoor that you put in the first time that you got access to the account, which some people will do. It doesn't undo any damage that happens on your original access to the account. If you stole a bunch of files, changing the password doesn't unsteal the files. It doesn't stop attack vectors which are persistent or which can re-execute. So for example, persistent client-side malware or persistent man-in-the-middle attacks or things like that.
It's still about online guessing attacks, right?
Well, if it's an offline guessing attack, I guess the way I'm thinking of that is, first of all, that happens so fast that he's probably got access. What the little niche, the little glitch that came in with the offline attacks is that if it is an offline attack and you change your password, and we get into this whole thing of, okay, So that assumed that the attacker somehow got a hold of a leaked password file. And then if there's an online attack and you change your password, you have to assume that he gets a hold of the leaked password file again. Right?
Well, I don't know. I'm not sure if this is one of the reasons why people have these policies, but I can imagine that if you have if the password file gets leaked and people have to change their passwords relatively quickly, by the time the attacker cracks all these passwords, it's already too late.
Right. So this gets back to the earlier point that was made is that if they're cracked, then the period between them being cracked and them actually being, if you call it cracked or compromised, but them actually being exploited as a result of that, if there's a lag and you change it in that lag period, you're okay. But if it turns out that you can go through the full exhaustive search in 9 days, I wouldn't want to be relying on this for my defensive protection, that we just happen to be a day ahead of the attacker using it.
My assumption, perhaps naively, was that the reason for the policy is the second one that you listed. It was trying to put some bound on when the password does get compromised, how long does the attacker have access? And you list some reasons why that's not that valuable, but presumably those reasons are not enough to convince people who make these policies.
So it does, I think, it's hard to say it gives no protection at all. So I think we have to acknowledge that it provides some advantage. The question is, at what cost? Because what we haven't measured at all in any of these equations is what is the cost and the impact to the users and the user's time. And the typical assumption is, well, they're unhappy, but that's free, right? Because, how do you guys feel about this? Well, And in enterprise environments, you guys are paid well, you should be made to suffer a little bit for all that pay you get, and so you do some things that we tell you to do, and that's fine. That doesn't work as well in the online environment. Of course, we don't see password expiration periods at all on the web. Right? Very few, very few.
It seems like either you have to show that the harm that you're preventing, you have to quantify the harm that you're preventing through this policy,
Right.
and argue that it's less than the time and money that we're spending on users,
Yeah.
or you have to argue that there's some other mechanism that would be more, or that because you have these changing policies, it's actually hurting security more than this is helping.
Yeah. So, but I mean, it is interesting to think about the question of if the main advantage is that you're limiting the period of access, and I guess there's two cases. One is that you're hoping that limit actually, the change happens before the exploit actually. Well, you're hoping if it's that you're stopping the continual access, well then a clever attacker, he may well already have what he wants, or maybe he's got another backdoor in. So it would seem that you've failed, and you're trying to salvage something, but it doesn't seem like the policy that you would really like to have a defense that works instead, that stops access originally. So, okay, so I'm pretty much done here. So in the end, what do the policies provide? I think it can temporarily stop ongoing access. Now, of course, if you temporarily stop it, then you have to worry about the next time that it's guessed. Did you stop it in time that time too? And then the next time it guessed, did you stop it? So, cumulatively again, this is not a winning game. But it, I think, is useful to revoke some sort of a delegated access. You're on vacation and you give the password to your colleague or your secretary or someone. And but that's a very useful feature. Now the second thing is, you guys are on shared projects while you're an intern here, and you come back, and if there's not a password change policy, you come back 2 years from now and you still have access to all the accounts you had 2 years ago when you're here. So this limits that. But if these are the two most useful, benefits, is there a cheaper way? Is there a cheaper way of addressing those issues than getting 100% of the population to change their password every 90 days? The other thing it does, as I mentioned, is it does force an offline attacker into having to grab a new copy of the hash file. But if grabbing a copy of the hash file is easy to begin with, then that's probably a problem. So we can talk about why that was possible to begin with and why there weren't other mechanisms in place to stop that from happening. You had a question, another question, Jeff?
Sort of summing up question. If you have one more slide you want to do.
This is my last slide. So there's, from what I've shown here, I think it's fair to say there is limited value, not no value, but limited value. But this is ignoring the usability impact, the usability costs, and perhaps one of the most damaging factors here is this result from Injin Zhang and his colleagues at North Carolina in their CCS 2010 paper. So if you know the current password, which is the case that you're trying to disrupt an ongoing access, if you know the current password, then it turns out, because people have these little algorithms that they use because they have to update it every month or 3 months, it's actually, for many accounts, or a significant percentage of accounts, it's actually possible to guess the next password. So they were able to find, they could guess for 17% of accounts, user accounts, with less than 5 guesses. If they knew the current password, they could guess the next password. Now that's pretty devastating, especially if you're thinking, well, we're going to change the password before it gets used. But if you actually know that it's the current password, and then you were able to verify this offline, and then you try to go online and it doesn't work, well, you know the old one, now you have to guess from that old one what's the next one. So that's a pretty severe attack against this password expiration policy as well. So I guess my view of this is that the benefits are at best partial and minor. They're not zero, but they're partial and minor. And there's no concrete evidence how useful they are. I'm trying to come up with a bound on them not being useful, but we haven't seen any evidence showing how useful they are. And so I'd like to see some of that evidence from someone before they continue to use these. And then I'll leave it with, what alternatives could deliver equivalent or almost equivalent benefits at lower costs to users. So that's all I had, and I'm happy to take questions and discuss other cases.
This is the most damaging thing about password expiration policies,
Okay.
which is that every restriction you put on a user causes them to choose from a smaller set of possible passwords.
Yeah.
And when you have to choose a password that's going to be easy for you to modify in 70 days or 90 days, you have to choose from the set that you know how to easily modify to make it memorable so you can make the minimal change to it again. You're going to further reduce you're going to make it even easier to guess passwords, and you're going to create popular passwords that weren't popular before, that are far more popular than some of the ones you have to worry about.
I understand that, and I think there's validity to that, but I've heard a counter-argument to that as well, and I've heard this from Cormac and others as well. But there's a possibility, and we haven't seen the studies, but there's the possibility that by forcing users to change passwords, the base password that they have in their little mnemonic or algorithm or whatever, the base password together with the little variation that they have, whether it's sticking the month on the end or some number on the end that rotates from 1 to 12, that might be harder to guess than the password they would have if there wasn't a password. So I'd love to see a study that you or colleagues do, but we don't know. We don't know which of those plays out.
So actually, just quickly, I agree with that point to some extent. I've often thought we make it to a point where our IT department sends out a note saying, after careful study, we've decided the very best password is foo. And now everybody should just start using that, because that satisfies all of our constraints. But seriously, I don't agree with the premise that we're using. And it's because I don't change my password because I fear there's some long-term, ongoing, slow, exhaustive search attack that somebody is mounting against my password, and that if I don't change it, eventually it'll get hit.
Right.
I change it because of leakage, and leakage is not represented in this model.
Are you worried about leakage like a man in the middle or a password hash file?
Neither. I'm worried about
Seeing a couple
exposure.
of keys as you type in.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not a big fan of crypto key rolling because I don't fear leakage there so much. But here, what I see all the time are things like somebody's in a meeting and they're logging in on the display and they think they're typing their username. They think they're in the username field, or they're in, sorry, they think they're in the password field, they're actually in the user fields. So it's displaying, and they get halfway through and they realize it, and they suddenly erase. And if they're supposed to change the password every 90 days, they might walk out of the meeting and say, oh, I guess I better change it now. But if this is a password that they've had for 5 years, they chose very carefully and think is really good, they're probably going to go away saying, well, I hope nobody really saw when I did that, because I don't really want to change this password that I've had for 5 years.
But to pick up on the point that you're saying that this analysis misses is basically the observation attack that the longer you're using a password for, the greater an accumulation of the probability that someone has seen you use that password.
Or seen parts of it. Maybe this meeting they saw the first half, and then because of something else, 6 months later, somebody saw the second half.
I think that's valid. Of course, the grand, the whole space of all the attackers, if that collapses down to just this tiny percentage that has seen you physically enter your password, that's a smaller subset than attackers from the other space.
Sure, but there are other leakage channels.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough.
So I will point out that like people at MSR give talks externally sometimes, and if they're giving like, sort of a talk on a projector like this, and it's recorded and it's made into a video, then pretty much anybody that watches it or cares to watch it,
well,
if you possibly see that flip out.
If you have a video onto someone typing the keys, that's a bad leakage.
Right. That's another place. It's exactly a place where there's a partial leakage.
Yeah.
Sometimes that over time,
Yeah.
over 6 months, maybe I caught the camera was in the right place.
I think
this.
I think that's fair, but again, this reminds me too of this great fear that everyone has about sticking a yellow sticky on your machine, and well, your risk there is your family members at home, your spouse, the cleaning ladies, all the rest. But again, that's worrisome, but it's a tiny fraction of all the attackers that are attacking from the other side of the world as well.
It's also not scalable, right? I mean, you could have the entire population of China trying to do visual collection of passwords, and there wouldn't be enough people to get the passwords through.
It does get us to an interesting other discussion about generic attacks versus targeted attacks, and if we start to talk about targeted attacks where someone wants to get into your laptop, I think we need a whole lot better than passwords securing our accounts if we're worried about targeted attacks. I just don't see them ever. That's a very difficult thing to defend against. I've got one question on my monitor here, and the question is, how about the benefit that aging policies prevent users from using the same password for all their properties or accounts? And certainly, if you're rotating, having an aging policy which causes you to rotate passwords probably causes that. No one really wants to, have this password when it has to get rotated, rotate all your other passwords at the same time. So that is a side benefit. Of course, from a usability point of view, you might actually want to be sharing your password amongst a bunch of low-value properties, but anyone that actually has an expiration policy in place probably considers themselves not a low-value property. So I think that is a potential benefit of the policies. It gets into password reuse and other things. Go ahead.
So we still don't know whether the password expiration policy will have impact on the distribution of the password, whether it makes whether people will have more unique password or like stores saying that whether people will choose worse password. So,
I would guess, we haven't seen the studies on this, I don't know if there are studies, but my guess would be it does flatten out the passwords. But if you're rotating between Fluffy and Dog and Marshmallow, if it's flatter but not flat enough to withstand attack, then we don't know that it helps, right? And I guess the real issue is if it is as predictable as the Zangatal study says, that if I know one of your passwords, then I can get the other ones with reasonable probability. That might be a more interesting question than how flat the distribution is.
they don't really have a good picture of what's the real distribution in new password, new system looks like. So they probably just use some difficult database.
Well, yeah, I think a lot of the online attackers would just go to a big database, and it's growing all the time. But you take the passwords at the head of the distribution. So, that won't map exactly onto the Microsoft or Microsoft Research set of passwords. But there's probably some overlap, and it's not that you want to guess 100% of the passwords. You'd be happy if you could guess maybe 1 or 2 or 5%, because that might get you in to allow you to do some privilege escalation attack or something else. Yeah. So I don't really have an answer to your first question, though.
We've heard a lot of good math in theory. Is it possible to conduct an empirical study on this to find out if it's harder to break into, you got 2 equal companies, one's got a password expiration policy and one doesn't? Is that something that is possible? How hard
Let me ask Mr. Schechter and Mr. Hurley here, your Microsoft colleagues, whether it would be possible to carry out an experiment like that.
For white hat or black hat?
I don't know which data would be more helpful.
I think black hats probably do it all the time, right? But they don't publish so much. And white hats, it's getting it past your legal team might be a little challenging. But the short answer is, I guess I don't think that there are good data sets. I don't think we even have a good data set of, there hasn't been a large scale breach of a data set that had a password expiration policy in place, right? So we don't know what the distribution, my guess would also be that it's somewhat flatter, but we don't, that's kind of speculation. We don't know by how much, and we certainly don't have any data that ones who do expiration have fared better than ones who do not.
Yeah, it's really only been the last 5 years or so that we've had some of these large breaches that have, and some of the studies, for example, Bonneau's study with the 70 million Yahoo passwords that he was able to, they cooperated with letting him analyze in a privacy-preserving way. But it's only in the last 5 years that we've had the benefit of some large data sets like this. This is one of the challenges in research in this area is you want to do empirical, you want to do ecologically valid research with real data sets rather than made up ones. You can, that's the ideal case. And it's hard to get exactly those passwords. There's been some studies that show that, studies with the Mechanical Turk and others have certain properties that are quite useful for studying, but it's a hard area to get real data on, and very large data sets is what you want.
You mentioned as an example, an 8-character data set from a 793 characters. That was an excellent number if people have real keyboard, and even uppercase is easy. Yeah. Now that we all type on little postage stamps, shouldn't you count keystrokes, which means going from lowercase a to the number 1 to uppercase B to lowercase c is God knows how many keystrokes.
Yeah, and I think the mobile phones, I would like to see a study. I know I can't recall having seen one, but I would like to see a study of how passwords chosen from mobile devices, what their key spaces are compared to passwords chosen on desktop machines. I don't think that would be a happy result either.
Any other questions?